I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us for today's presentation on supporting students with learning differences during distance learning, organized by the Stanford Graduate School of Education. My name is Manas Mansour, and I will moderate today's Q&A session with today's speakers after their presentation. I'll go ahead and turn it over to our presenters and kick it over with Professor Elizabeth Kozlowski. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and James and Jose for joining us today.
I want to welcome everyone to be here, and we're looking forward to a very rich conversation with all of you. The amazing experiences that everybody's had since the COVID crisis struck, the challenges, the opportunities, the risks, and what it means for the future. We hope that we can spark some great conversation today. Jamie Basham is a colleague of mine from the University of Kansas and also from CAST. Jose Blackerby is also from CAST, and I've known Jose's from the days that he was working at SRI here in Palo Alto. So it's a pleasure to have the three of us reunited today. So we're framing our conversation around designing for the margins. Everything that we're thinking about is focused on the full range of human variants and how we might tailor learning to meet the needs of everyone. So I want to frame our conversation in three arenas. One is, what are we learning in this time of COVID? All of you are here because you are doing it right now. We want to share the things that we know from people who are doing research, from the experiences of individuals that we've worked with, and from the field in terms of what we understand about the most effective practices. We also want to highlight some of the fractures in knowledge building that exist around how we might learn best from the situations that we're in to turn around and do better the next day, but also to do better for the future. And we also want to highlight, by the time we're finished, the fragility of the infrastructures that we're currently using, both because of the people who are using them, but also because of the access and opportunity that many people do not have to access the full range of the infrastructures that are available. So we hope to touch on all three of those as we move forward. But first, I'd like to have Jose and Jamie tell you a little bit more about themselves, and then I'll finish with telling you a little bit more about what I'm doing at Stanford in regards to the Learning Differences Initiative. Jose, do you want to start?
Sure. Nice to meet everybody. I see people from all over the world with really, really interesting questions. So it's just nice to meet everyone. My name is Jose Blackerby. As Elizabeth said, I currently work at CAST, which is a small but mighty nonprofit just outside of Boston. CAST is best known for universal design for learning. And in our work, we try to look at all kinds of variability and how it interacts with barriers in learning environments. And we try to design solutions that minimize or remove them. We also try to work with educators and technology developers and content developers of all kinds to implement and include UDL in their work. I also have the good fortune to co-teach the UDL class at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where Liz and I actually say every semester that we teach the course that we learn much, much more from the students than they could ever learn from us. And we try to push the boundaries of universal design for learning. We might try to take some risks. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. Looking forward to this conversation today. Jamie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Basham. I'm a professor at the University of Kansas in the Department of Special Education, where Elizabeth and I worked together for a number of years. And I'm also the Senior Director of Learning and Innovation at CAST, the same nonprofit that Jose works at. My work is primarily focused on how do we design and implement learning environments designed for all students from the very beginning, and foundationally principled in this universal design for learning. Throughout that time, I do work in both, physical environments as well as digital environments and the blending of the two. And within the last, about 10 years ago, I helped run the National Center for Online Learning and Students with Disabilities. So that we had a research center at the University of Kansas that was a nationally funded research center that actually investigated and supported research around online learning and students with disabilities. And so kind of came into the conversation at COVID with some understanding of how we operate in these environments.
Thanks, Jamie. I remember when you got that grant. That was
Yeah.
really big. That was very exciting. You
It
did some
was.
really good work with that particular grant and went on to look at equity in distance education, which I think is something that I hope we can highlight today. I want all of you to know that the Graduate School of Education at Stanford has made some significant investments in pushing the conversation of learning differences forward, and is examining the future of special education and as one of many avenues of accounting for and addressing and supporting learner difference across the full range of human capacity. And I came to Stanford in 2018 to start that initiative, and I'm very, very excited to tell you that since I got here, we've hired 5 faculty specifically to work on that initiative, and we have been gathering momentum over the last 2.5 years around the work that lies ahead and the work that we intend to do. And most significantly and apropos to this particular presentation is that we have been working with families who identify as Latinx in the San Jose area and helping to convene them and their families with technologists in the Silicon Valley to examine the user interface for technologies that already exist and are being used in the public school systems here on the peninsula and elsewhere, to try and better understand what we need to do to make sure that each and every family and each and every child has the conditions that are necessary to make learning happen. One of the things that's been clear since March and schools began to teach online is that COVID exposed deep problems in our educational system as it relates to equity, both in terms of the ramps into learning lessons and learning and the availability of the tools for learning at a distance level, but also in terms of access to broadband internet, access to the equipment that people need to use the systems that school districts seem to use, things like Canvas and other platforms for learning. And we watched as teachers tried to figure out how to translate what they do in classrooms into an online environment, often making a literal translation from one space to another. And very quickly, I think a lot of teachers learned that that kind of translational work was not effective for them or for their students. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But a critical piece that families told us over and over again in a number of surveys across the country is that the impact on families of trying to manage busy careers and outside obligations with the intensity that's required to make sure that students have routines and support to get them started in the morning, to sustain their interest over time, to get feedback for what they're doing, to understand how learning in a digital environment, what kinds of feedback can come to them. All of these things have taught us that we have deep problems in how this all exists. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And I'm wondering, Jose and Jamie, what would you add to that list, or how would you characterize the kinds of things that I mentioned?
So Elizabeth, I agree with everything you said. And I think, one thing that is really clear with all of the weaknesses that have been exposed, it has created an opportunity for us to think hard about the way we do our work, the ways in which it is effective and the ways in which it isn't. In terms of remote learning, it's interesting because it really has been with us for a long time. It was distance education way back in the day, and there were particular education contexts where distance learning fulfilled very unique needs, people who were in rural areas or credit recovery or other areas like that. And then there was this considerable growth over the last 10 years. You can graduate from schools in all 50 states going through the online system. The reality on those systems for students with disabilities has been very, very variable. Some systems have been very, very inaccessible, not been able to support students with disabilities at all. And with the big growth this spring, it showed all of the cracks. However, it is going to maintain a larger part of the education landscape going forward.
One of the things that we've learned and we've actually known for a long time is that variability is real in all of our students. But then when we think about students with disabilities specifically, and what COVID has really exposed is the real need for us to focus on two different areas. And one is the practical everyday sort of things that we need to do to advance learning and education now, as well as think about the future, right? So finding a balance between those two things. In the practical everyday, having school districts partner and support partnerships and collaborations with families to help understand some of the variability and the equity issues that COVID's uncovered is critically important, so that schools and educators can work together with the families to say, how do we support this remote learning? But then also, I think what we have to start talking about, as kind of Jose was alluding to, is what opportunities has this uncovered? And I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity within this in thinking about how we can partner with technology companies, with educators and families to think about the future and what we really want these systems to be like as we move forward.
For us, when we were preparing for this presentation, one of the things that we started thinking about is how school is tailored to a construct of what normal is. And our big joke among the three of us was, well, it started in the Renaissance. It started with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci with trying to figure out what the ideal body is and to measure it and talk about it and act as if it was an achievable and appropriate goal. And that has, in lots of different ways, permeated the way that we design our educational system. So our question is, how do we shift from a deficit to an asset-based approach to teaching and learning?
I would just echo that this idea that there is a typical, whether it's a typical student, a typical teacher, a typical voter, a typical anything, has made its way through all kinds of parts of our society, not just schools, but the workplace, how we build products, right? How we make decisions about hiring, all of those things. This is something that is throughout the society.
I completely agree. I think, since it's permeated everything that we have in society, it's actually what we think about most often when we think about how do we measure success in learning? How do we measure success in schools? All these things play a role in how we're actually interpreting our day-to-day lives in the midst of COVID and in the design of these learning environments and supporting those things. And I think one of the things that we have to start thinking about are the assumptions correct? And actually what we do know is that they're actually not correct, that there's actually not the average in everyday life. And that's no more clear than it is today in who we are as a society and what we're dealing with in the education system.
So Daniel, thank you for your comment to the whole group. I think we're all starting from that premise, but what it means is that we have to build for the edges. We have to build for a variety of different abilities. We have to build for a variety of different cultures that define us through our gender, cultures that define us through our language, cultures that define us through the work that we do through a number of features that create a situation in which some people are able to access what's going on with learning and others aren't. And teachers in particular, and the design of the lessons and the curriculum that they're asked to teach are also being asked to be creative about figuring out what the edges, what it might mean to design for the edges. And I think first and foremost in this particular arena, particularly when we're dealing with a three-legged stool, the parents, the families, the kids, and the teacher, the conversation about design can be richer than ever. If I know something about how a student might need to communicate through distance learning, I need to build that in to my lesson planning time so that students have an opportunity to either communicate directly with me or communicate with their peers so that there is some reciprocity going on in terms of constructing understanding of concepts that are being taught. It's probably not a very effective methodology to plan to teach to a class of 25 students. It's far more effective in distance learning to run small groups of students together, picking students who are going to be in groups together to facilitate learning for all students. Jamie and Jose, do you have some other experiences about teachers who are designing for the edges?
Elizabeth, I want to talk about how the world has been changing very rapidly as of late. But the organization we work for, CAST, is associated with Universal Design for Learning, and if you're interested in it, it's a framework about addressing variability in how information is presented, how it is acted upon, and how students engage with it. And it's been growing internationally, really, over the last 20 years. However, the kind of barriers that we were thinking of mostly were ones that were associated with federal disability categories. So whether that's learning disability or deafness or vision. And we have recently just become much increasingly aware that there are many, many other kinds of barriers, right? Many kinds that Elizabeth mentioned, and that we have to do some work to get the right people around the table so that our work does, and our design does actually address things like culture, things like sexual orientation, things like class. And so we are kind of in a period of maybe not revolution, but significant change. Jamie?
Yeah, I think some of the work that we've already shown and have been working towards, for me, it begins with UDL, because UDL as a whole establishes the fact that there's variability amongst all of us, and that we actually have to design for that variability from the very beginning, from a proactive sort of stance. And so when we design for the edges, we think about that type of variability in developing the environments and learning experiences around the individuals and around the variability that's going to be there. That includes abilities, culture, class, et cetera. But what we also have to realize is that design is not just a linear process, that it actually is very messy. And we kind of think schools tend to be very linear, and they tend to think you're going to move from grade level to grade level day to day. And that's not necessarily the case. We have to also recognize when we have to go back and redesign. We have to iterate that design. And I think what we've learned and what we're going through is continually that process of gaining a better understanding of what it means to, where are the edges, redefining the edges. But it starts in looking at the UDL guidelines and supporting that as an essential foundation.
We want to make sure that we have time for Q&A, and I see a lot of really good conversation going on in the chat box. But before we finish, we want to make sure that we highlight some things that have come out of the work that we have been doing. One of them is to share with you that there are schools, both here in the US and also in Canada, that have been doing distance and in-person blended education for long periods of time. And one of the things that I've learned in working with those schools is that the relationship between families and teachers is critical for making sure that the routines and practices that are set up to support learning at home are things that teachers can help to mediate and support with families together, and that time in the educational an educational quarter or semester for family and teacher interaction is absolutely essential. And a second piece of that is that student teacher reciprocal feedback, direct and frequent, is necessary so that teachers can continue to craft and hone what they're doing for individual students to support their learning. Jamie and Jose?
Yeah, continually what we found in the multiple years of doing research in this very area is that the partnership between the family and the school is critically important. And so that, especially in fully online environments, that we really have to kind of focus on that. Some other primary takeaways, as you kind of just highlighted quite a few of them actually, is that we also have to focus on executive functioning more. And we can go into more detail about that if people are wanting it. But one of the things that within these digital and blended environments and all of the fast-paced sort of stuff going on is that executive functioning for students, especially students with disabilities, is often a very difficult thing. I mean, and in fact, if anyone out there is a high school or even a middle school teacher, you realize executive functioning is difficult, but it's something that's often overlooked. And so providing tools and supports for executive functioning was found to be really critically important in supporting systems that really work for students with disabilities that are in online or blended settings. So,
JB, building on that, one of the things that's happened during COVID, right, is that there's been this explosion of information and resources, right, which has created this huge executive function challenge for all of us, right? There is a lot of information out there in various forms, and sorting out, what makes sense for you, sorting out what is a product versus a case study, finding the right stuff that will meet your needs could take a lot of time. A lot of people have just sort of thrown their arms up, and in exasperation. So the executive function challenges really are for everybody. It's not just the students.
I also think it's important to think about, because we're going to spend some time, I know, in Q&A, primarily around some practical strategies that can help people probably for tomorrow or later this week or next week or whatever. But given Stanford's location in the middle of Silicon Valley and the intersection that takes place with technology and the work going on in online and blended settings in our schools today, we should also be recognized there's lots of opportunity there to really think differently about the way we design systems to support all learners from the very beginning, and the role parents and educators can take in partnering and letting these companies know what needs to be done to develop systems for all students. And so I think there's a way that there could be some relationships built to not only support what needs to happen in today's world tomorrow, but literally tomorrow, but we also have to think about what we're going to need going down the line here. I mean, so lessons learned and a takeaway from all this is that maybe some systems got caught by surprise in the need to move quickly to an online learning sort of setting or a blended setting. But the reality is this has been forthcoming for a long, long time. If it wasn't COVID, it would have been something else. And so we have to take the lessons learned and actually use these lessons to an advantage in the future and think about the types of systems and the types of personnel we need trained, et cetera. And so we often we have that sort of focus on what's happening tomorrow when we also need to focus on what's happening beyond tomorrow.
I'm going to open this up now. There's a bunch of questions right now in the chat box.
For our first question, I think as we started to talk about executive functioning, that spurred a lot of comments. How do you kind of make sense of the right executive functioning tools and opportunities? Like how can I, as a caregiver, a parent, an educator, a policymaker, really interact with an executive functioning resource and know that that is right for me? What are some tips and strategies that I could use?
It's kind of a loaded question, actually. One, because even as an adult, people are continually switching the tools they use on a day-to-day basis. So if we think about executive function as the sort of mental processes to kind of help support decision-making, to support self-control, self-regulation, and things like that, we all have different ways in which we do that and the tools that we use. Just in fact, today I was looking for, I was using one app and I was like, oh, this isn't quite working now as I wanted it to. And I was looking for another app earlier today. So one of the things we have to recognize is that even as adults, we flip and flop to different apps. And so as a parent or as an educator that's working with students, one of the things I would focus on if we're looking for tools is to think about what's actually working and help the students realize and understand what's working for them. I mean, one of the primary, we're not going to get a lot into universal design for learning as a framework, but one of the primary goals of UDL as a whole is to develop expert learners, people that really understand who they are as a learner. And that starts at a very young age. And we work with students even in preschool all the way through obviously university and adulthood. And your depth of understanding of what it means to be an expert learner changes. But so what we have to do as a parent or as an educator in supporting executive function is to help them understand what's working, help them do some self-reflection. And just my son, in fact, today, last night, as a middle schooler, we were working through with him on a problem he was facing with not getting assignments turned in on time. Okay, so let's reflect on why that happened and what we could put in place to make that work and try some things and then reflect with him tomorrow. And these are some things that people can do all day. Elizabeth, I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important to understand is that language mediates our ability to manage how we feel. The first part of language is even to have language about the different feelings that we have. Am I interested? Does this make me excited? Do I want to know what's going to happen next? These things that become first language in exchange with an adult or an older peer become internalized very early in a child's life cycle. So when a child's learning how to tie their shoes, they learn how to say, I'm going to make rabbit ears and turn this, and turn them, twist them together. And they say that out loud, and pretty soon that language becomes internalized, and they learn to have internal dialogue with themselves. And so as you build on social emotional learning, you combine somatic, relational kinds of feelings with knowledge building activities and get kids to begin to think about, how did you do this? How did you know what to do? When did you decide to do it? And all of these things are part of self-regulatory behaviors. But if we're not talking about them and explaining them, and if our digital platforms don't give information back to learners about when they're doing it well, what kind of feedback they need to help support it, we can get in trouble pretty early. But we can ask for and figure out even things like putting a little timepiece in a PowerPoint to remind kids that you only have a few minutes to start doing this. Are you organized to do it? Do you know what it will look like when you get at the end? These are strategies that will help kids prepare and do things more independently.
So I would just also say that this is an area where private enterprise has really done its thing. There are, tons of products out there, apps that are trying to get at one part of this or another, managing distractions, planners, trying to reduce the complexity of web pages. There's a ton of different things that are out there. There are some resources that have been put together by a foundation, by foundation funded efforts like Innovate EDU, and then there's some of the government ones too. But again, on EFF, you have to also know what you're searching for, right? If you don't have the language, you're just experiencing a problem, the search function isn't going to help you. So
I was just looking at the comment from Victoria about how do you communicate with schools about the need for more collaboration when you feel like it's not actually happening. One of the things that I'd encourage you to do is to connect with some of the regional parent support centers that are in your states, and they have good information about collaborative practices for families that you can share with teachers in your building. It's often helpful, if that's not happening, to think about somebody else who can help be a mediator for you, to have those kinds of conversations. We have tons of data in the special education literature about the importance of collaboration, and when things get dicey, the importance of more collaboration. So it's a research-based, evidence-based practice that if you need help actually having those conversations, there are parent information centers that can help you mediate some of that.
This question is from Aisha. Some of my classmates with ADHD face difficulty concentrating during online classes. How can I help my school become more accommodating, and what can I do as their classmate in order to help them?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a great question. So, and I'm looking for that. I'm trying to recall. This is my executive functioning again, kicking in. So it's in a online setting, right? Did I hear that? Great.
Yep,
I mean,
it would be in an online setting.
So there's a couple things to think about right away, right? Is to maybe, and she suggested guidance for the school itself. So to have the school maybe help parents and families think about establishing learning environments in the home and what that might look like. Establishing routines associated with the learning. Those are some things that are, and it could be a kitchen table. It doesn't have to be really fancy. I mean, it doesn't have to be fancy at all, but establishing that and then establishing some routines. Again, we talked about executive functioning, but having, planned routines for, jotting down notes. What can you do? What are the assignments? I know they're going to put it out on Google Class or some other platform they're going to be using, but maybe writing them down, taking notes just like you would at school. But then also having the school advance a concept of giving students some choice in how they go through the learning process and how they demonstrate their understanding and how they're going to engage the learners in the process. Oftentimes we think that online or even blended learning, if it's in a remote sort of setting, doesn't involve sort of hands-on activity. And I think there's lots of opportunity for hands-on activity that really help some learners concentrate. Because they get to use their hands instead of just watching the screen. And so there's some quick things.
A lot of text in your comment about we need the education school district to accommodate the kind of immense transformation that's necessary to make digital learning really work well. And it requires an investment in how time is used. It requires an investment in how teachers are supported. It requires an investment in even changing the nature of the working day and who's working at what time. It involves systems design at the school level so that there's steering committees, so that information is flowing directly from families into the teacher unit so that teachers can make powerful shifts that are not just one-offs, but actually require systems change inside of the school. But then Vera said something really important, is that teachers are like first responders in our medical system. They're the ones that are on the front lines. They're trying to figure out their knowledge base is being challenged at the very moment that they're responsible for all of the students and all of the families who are in their classrooms. And we need to ask, we need to demand that their mental health, their ability to manage themselves is also being tackled. And I think that steering committees at the school level, but also at the systems level, to redesign and work with teacher unions to redesign the nature of the teacher workforce patterns is absolutely critical as we move forward. The other thing that I wanted to say in response to Vera's comment is anybody teaching things about universal designs for learning? And I think I'm enjoying that you asked that, because that's what we're doing right now. I'm teaching a class right now to secondary teachers on UDL. I know that Jamie and Jose are both very involved in that as well. There are a number of universities across the country who are doing this work. Sometimes it feels like the UDL work has not deeply engaged people in the idea of design, that it's still seen as a remedy and not as a shift in the fundamental practice of how do we design learning, but I think it's coming. And there's better understanding, and there's certainly places where people are doing it incredibly well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, everyone's doing some great work in UDL. It's actually, in UDL, by the way, has been around for 20 plus years. I mean, it's not a fly by night sort of thing. It's based on mind, brain, and educational research. So it kind of brings together multiple fields of understanding. And it's been applied in settings and has shown tremendous success in bringing forth and transforming learning environments that are struggling, as well as supporting the development of more expert learners, which we kind of have talked about. I'll drop a resource in the chat here in a minute, but the UDL field has kind of come together to develop a platform called Learning Designed. And it's a nonprofit-based platform that offers an understanding of what UDL is, as well as micro-credentials to help educators and parents, if they wanted to, learn more about UDL and have some competencies in that, as well as resources for supporting it in your school.
I'm just seeing some questions that are really good questions about, like, instances where it's really the first time that families are being asked to grapple with all of the technology and these apps and all these new roles, and it's hard, and I think one thing really, and this is just sounds like it would just so obvious, but you really have to start simple, right? Like pick a few things, small things, get those to work. I think one of the things that happened a bunch in the spring, and I think still to some degree now, is that there are too many things, and people go from one to the other, and there's not any coherence. So simple solutions first.
Spot on. Start simple. Get something you can accomplish as a parent, as a teacher. Start on something you can actually be successful at doing, and that your students can be successful at doing, and start from there.
I should also note too, Hugsy, the courses are all online this year, and there's been, as I'm sure at a lot of universities, a lot of talk about how to make that effective and a positive experience. And it's a work in progress, but one of the things that came up is kind of like the simple thing is you have to just dramatically rethink how much content you can actually cover, right? The idea that you can take, a syllabus that worked in on a face-to-face setting, it's just different. You just have to think about it differently. And it has to be chunked and it has to be smaller. So, and UDL is a good resource for trying to give options about how to do that.
I want to put in a plug here for everyone to remember that we don't have to be experts by ourselves, that our children are experts about things that we don't know about. Family members can be experts about something that we don't know about. Other teachers can be experts about something that we don't know about. And the biggest power that learning together in this virtual environment has is that we can draw on each other's ideas and knowledge and put it into our own practice almost immediately or with very little additional guidance. And I think we keep thinking that knowledge is something we're supposed to have ourselves and we're supposed to know it all. And one of the humbling experiences, but I think incredibly relevant to what it means to live in inclusive communities, is that we all bring assets. And when we don't know anything, just like I modeled earlier today, Manoof, what do I do with, my computer and putting this thing on the screen? That kind of breaking of the barrier between somebody who's the teacher who's supposed to know things and the people that you're supposed to be teaching, when we begin to pull those barriers down and realize that we're in a real learning community together, that's one of the amazing assets to me of this opportunity that we have to learn together. And I think we're getting very close to the end, but one of the things that's at least happening for me, and I hope it is happening for many of you, is that I'm getting ideas about doing research on things that I never thought of before. So one of the things that I've come up with, because of the principles that exist inside of my head around ableism and inclusivity and equity, was to really think about kids who have significant learning barriers in terms of even making digital images have any meaning at all to them. How can I use the principles of inclusion and still engage kids around a screen that may not have any meaning to them for the moment? And so I've asked some students, some children who love to do Minecraft, to engage with me in a learning project with kids with really significant needs to learn how to break the barrier between digital and lived realities, to see if we can build a Minecraft space that will afford that across a virtual distance. And we're right in the middle of pulling that off. But I never would have thought of that if this situation hadn't happened and I started thinking about all the families that I know of that are getting up in the middle of the night wondering where their kids are, and they're wandering around the house, and then they've got to get them working at 8 o'clock in the morning on their screens, and just the incredible challenge that families are facing. And we are so inadequately prepared to do this kind of work. But I think incredible things will come from it. And I'm so excited so many of you decided to join us today on this journey of discovery.
James and Jose, could I actually ask you to respond to Elizabeth's response and her question about how the past 8 months have opened your horizons about what you're researching and the questions that you're asking? And then after you both respond, I have one last question for all three of you.
So we were doing some of this research ahead of, multiple years ago on online, blended, and digital learning environments for students with disabilities. And what we knew then, and what we advised as we talked to different groups around this, was that if something like this were to emerge, that it would completely transform. It would completely transform the relationship the family has with the educational process. And that's exactly what's happened. So that was kind of as predicted, but what it's really opened the door for me in thinking about is not only what we need to do, as I said today, as I was saying earlier a few minutes ago, what we have to do today to get through tomorrow, but really it has me thinking a lot about, what can we do as a system, as an education system to support for the future? What sort of personnel do we need in place? What sorts of underlying design structures do we need in place? I mean, one of the things that I've spent more time working on is thinking about the intersection of policy and systems design as it relates to what our families are going through today. And then how do we bring in a private-public sort of partnership through our technology companies that help support tools that really provide for meaningful relationships in the way educators can interact with families and students?
A couple of ways of answering it. First, on the good side, some of the things that we have been working on were already online, right? So rethinking about them in an online environment wasn't that hard, but getting them out there at scale turned out to be kind of difficult, and it's made us rethink about how we're going to go about design and scale. Ed Metz, who works for the Department of Education, sent out. He wanted links to resources from organizations that had gotten money from the Department of Ed. I don't know what the number was, but it was some huge amount of money that has been spent over the last 10 years. And a lot of it wasn't available. And he was like, that seems pretty crappy. Like, we invested all these resources as a society, and these things are either don't work or they're not available. So it's made us think, like, we don't want to be on the wrong side of that. The other thing on the disruption front, I've been in this field for a pretty long time now, and in a lot of areas, in student learning and accessibility and special education, when I'm writing a grant proposal, the introductory paragraph that I wrote in 1990, I could almost write today, almost verbatim, and I'm sick of it. I don't want to be writing the same introductory paragraphs in 5 years. I want us to have, taken on the big challenge of these challenges that have been raised, and that we make some differences.